All right, let's get started. I want to welcome everyone here. My name is Joshua Tucker. I am the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU. And along with my co-compatriot on all this, Alexander Cooley, who's the director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installation of our New York City Russia Public Policy Seminar Series. What we try to do here is we try to address pressing topics related to Russian policy. And we gather together both academics and practitioners to try to get an educated discussion that draws on the academic literature and as much as possible also draws on what's going on the ground. This series has been going on for a number of years now, thanks to very generous support for the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who has supported this series in its entirety. And we're thrilled to have all of you here with us today. Just to give a quick overview of what's going to happen, I'm going to pass it over to Alex, and Alex will say a few words about our general topic for today, and then introduce our speakers. Our speakers will each have approximately 10, maybe 12 minutes, but not much more than that, to give some introductory remarks, and then we'll open it up to question and answer. There'll be some roundtable discussion among the speakers, and we'll take questions from the audience. The one thing I want to mention is that one of the nice things about being on Zoom or for folks who are watching on YouTube, being on YouTube, is that you can drop questions into the chat while the speakers are speaking. We're not going to interrupt them. It's not going to involve with interrupting them, but then we'll have a list of questions to jump into once the speakers are done presenting. So feel absolutely free to use the chat to list questions during the talk while the talks are going on. Same thing with the chat on YouTube. We'll be taking a look at both of them. Because we're in a webinar format, unfortunately, we can't ask you to pipe up and ask the question yourself. So Alex and I will ask the questions, but we can't ask them if they're not in the chat. So without further ado, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us at your lunchtime on the East Coast, breakfast on the West Coast, and dinner time or post-dinner in Moscow. We're very much looking forward to the discussion. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, Josh, thanks so much. So the topic is, of course, timely, but the expertise that we have on this panel, I'm just really excited for. So I think all of the speakers today have not only research experience on the topic, but have also been involved in setting and participating in the public framing and engagement about the topic. I think, looking at the Russian-Afghanistan, Russian-Central Asian relationship, or if you want to think of it as a triangle, maybe that's one thing for discussion, is especially important given, some of the recent US commentary that we've seen about Afghanistan, namely that the US is leaving some sort of chaos and instability, that the US has really failed in the same way as the Soviet Union failed, and so forth. So what we'd like to do is really take a look at what the regional dynamics have been in Afghanistan, how Russian strategy and thinking about its relationship with Afghanistan and Central Asia have evolved, get a perspective from of Central Asia on regional developments and on the relationship in Russia, and then bring some historical perspective in terms of withdrawing from Afghanistan a few decades ago and then now. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers as they come up. You can see their full bios posted in the chat or our event announcement. And our opening speaker is Ivan Safranchuk, who is the director of the Center of Euro-Asian Research and senior fellow with the Institute for International Studies at MGIMO University and an associate professor at National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and has been commenting and writing on Russian Central Asian relations for many years. So Ivan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think that is a very good series you have, and now you have a very timely topic. It's quite a challenge for me to be the first speaker to open the panel and to set the scene for this discussion, because the topic is very fragmented. There are so many nuances, issues, and everyone who talks now from a perspective of a particular country or from a regional perspective, everyone who talks on Afghanistan says something and then says 5, 10, or 20 buts. So for every statement there is but, or you should understand, and then something is said which may contradict actually the initial point. That's why the topic is really, if not in a mess, but in extreme flux. And that is true for every country in the region and for the region as a whole. That's why I'm trying to detect a sort of center of gravity from which you can start to develop the issue in more or less consistent and coherent way. And for me, that center of gravity is that the region anticipated America's withdrawal from Afghanistan for about 10 years. I think that after the Obama administration, in particular after the first Obama administration, it was clear for everyone that earlier or later it is going to happen. The issue is that some countries wanted to facilitate America's withdrawal, other countries wanted to slow it down and make America stay as long as possible. And everyone was playing its own game with this regard. Some countries did not believe that America may withdraw, but or at least they were saying in this, they were talking in this way. But I think that finally everyone was thinking that, okay, finally that is going to happen. We want that to happen earlier or later. And some countries wanted that to happen earlier. And exactly those countries who facilitated and anticipated most actively America's withdrawal take themselves as winners now in the regional situation. This is Pakistan, this is Russia, and to some extent China, and to some extent Iran. There are some countries which did not want America to withdraw. And this is, for me, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, first of all. And I would say that Uzbekistan at some point shifted position. Uzbekistan wanted very much for long America to stabilize Afghanistan so that it becomes available for big infrastructural projects. But in the recent years, in my understanding, Uzbekistan turned to believe that without America, Afghanistan may be more stable than with America. And that's why Uzbekistan also moved to the camp of those who are okay with America's withdrawal. However, after withdrawal happened, I think everyone in the international community and regional countries were finally sort of relieved. Finally, that happened. Somebody wanted, somebody did not want it, but it was a relief for everyone. It was an opportunity to turn the page and start something new. And the very prevailing idea was that it would be possible to exchange relatively modest position of Taliban on various economic, social, and political issues, in particular social issues like children's education, in particular girls' education, women's rights, and so on. So there would be an opportunity to exchange Taliban's softness on all these various issues for some sort of recognition, formal or informal recognition of this government and engagement with this government. And I think that in the last 2 months, most of the international politics and regional politics on the issue were around this exchange. However, some countries had tougher conditions for this exchange, in particular Tajikistan. Tajikistan wanted Taliban to be very inclusive and to be soft, not hostile on the Tajik community, first of all, socially, but also politically. But other countries, regional countries, had very low conditions to Taliban. That is Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, first of all. There is a very special position of Kyrgyzstan, which has no practical interest in Afghanistan, but for some reasons, which I do not want to develop right now, takes quite active position on the Afghan issue, and that is more pro-Taliban position. And Russia also joined the camp of those in the region who had low conditions to Taliban. However, as we see in the last 2 months, Taliban, the government of Taliban is not really modest. It is building quite conservative regime in Afghanistan. And when we usually discuss whether the Taliban changed or not, my position is that the Taliban did not change internally. They are within the same mindset, very conservative, very religious, and they want us actually to recognize them not as post-war Taliban, but they want to recognize us as the continuation of their regime in the late 90s, which I think is a clear indication that they did not change their mindset. And they are going to build very tough regime. But at the same time, they changed in a way that they are not now they are not now in the avant-garde of international jihadist movement. So they are more Afghanistan focused more than in the 90s. And that's why, just to make the comparison, I would say that they are changed like Bolsheviks changed in the 20s and 30s. They are not anymore Lenin or Trotsky style Bolsheviks. They are not anymore Lenin or Trotsky style Bolsheviks. They are Stalin style Bolsheviks. They are going to be very tough in the country, but they are not for big international, in this case, jihadist revolution, and they are not promoting it too actively. And that, I think, is a good news for everyone. However, the question how tolerant we are to what they are doing inside their country becomes a very important issue. As far as I understand, the international community is actually dividing into those who have not very much tolerance to what the Taliban is going to do inside, and that's why it's not going to help the Taliban as far as it is a hardliners regime, and into those who have very low conditions to what the Taliban is doing inside the country. Clearly, Russia and the United States are about to fall into these 2 different baskets. Russia is more accommodative to the Taliban and has little conditions to what it is doing inside. And probably the United States, many European countries are going to be more tougher on Taliban. Regionally, so far, we also have quite low conditions for Taliban, except in Tajikistan. Tajikistan is very preoccupied with the social and political position of the ethnic Tajik community in Afghanistan, and I think that Tajikistan will continue to help this community in some way. Will it lead to big regional divisions? No, I do not think that it will lead very quickly to regional divisions. I think a lot will depend how the Taliban will feel after the winter and how much country it will control, what will be the condition of the country, whether they will be able to deliver some basic social needs of the population. I think that these are all very open questions, and we will have preliminary answers to them in the spring and summer. Before that, it's very hard to talk about the sustainability of the regime. What we can say is that the more conservative the Taliban is, the more focused they are on their agenda, the more likely there will be internal resistance. Not necessarily a civil war from the very beginning, but some civil paramilitary resistance, I think, is inevitable, because there are millions of people in Afghanistan who feel threat from the Taliban and will in some way defend just their lives, not even political and social positions, but their lives for the beginning. Russia right now, I would say, sees the whole Afghan situation as a big opportunity, as a big regional opportunity, as a very favorable regional situation. And the Russian policy right now is to keep as much as possible international agreement on Afghanistan, and to keep as much as possible regional agreement on Afghanistan. As I said before, from my point of view, the international community is going to divide into those who want the Taliban to succeed and into those who at worst want the Taliban to fail, or at best want the Taliban to face hard challenges and see how the Taliban tackles them. So on the international arena, I think we will have more divide on Afghanistan than unity. But in the regional context, Russia is doing a lot and so far succeeds in keeping more or less coherent regional position on Afghanistan and the Taliban.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Ivan, for that scene setter. To now drill into specifically what Russia has been doing, because there is a history with Afghanistan, and we're delighted that we have Ekaterina Stepanova, who heads the Peace and Conflict Studies Unit and is a lead researcher at the National Research Institute of the World Economy and International Relations, MMO in Moscow, here with us. She has numerous publications, including a really relevant one in this year's Europe and Eurasia studies on Russia's policy over the last few years to Afghanistan. So thank you so much, Katya, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Good, good. Well, there'll be slight dissonance to Vanya, as always, and starting from my first, starting from the start. Because in fact, the Taliban's role, as I see it, has significantly evolved. If not necessarily their ideology, but their role has significantly evolved since the first period of their rule in Afghanistan. And it's their activities back in the 90s, that served as a rationale for their inclusion into Russia's official terrorist list of terrorist groups in 2003, when this list was first formed. There was a specific reference to one incident, which was hijack of a Russian plane back in 1995, even before the Taliban became a de facto government, with hostages taken, whatever. And there were some references to unspecified links to the Chechen insurgents, long defeated since then, yeah. And then to support to Islamist movements seeking to overthrow some of Central Asian governments. Russia has since kept the Taliban on its list of terrorist groups all these years for all sorts of reasons. Including, of course, as a genuine anti-terrorism leverage, one of very few it has vis-a-vis Afghanistan, but also more recently as a way to accommodate its Central Asian allies' worries, and also as another external threat justification for the CSTO role in Central Asia and so on. The thing is that more recently, and particularly in the previous decade, in 2010s, already. Russia's real anti-terrorist concern about Afghanistan gradually shifted to two other main sources of risk, not necessarily or not directly Taliban related. Okay, and the main risk came actually in the form of overlap of these two in the Afghan north, okay, in northern Afghanistan. So one risk was this deeply embedded, fragmented, long-time Islamist militant milieu, militant mosaic in the north. All this small group, some local, some heavy presence of Central Asian exiles as well, exiled militants. But that has been around for some time. Yeah, a more recent risk, second risk, was this new phenomena of ISIS in Afghanistan, which specifically in the north included some ISIS Khorasan, ISIS Afghan branch militants who relocated from the east, from the original hotbed in Nangarhar. Yeah, but mainly these were local, self-identified or self-generated Daesh militants, and more recently they were joined by a couple of hundreds, maybe a bit more, foreign terrorist fighters, mostly of Central Asian origin, relocating from Syria and Iraq. Now, overall potential of spillover of all of this into Central Asia has not been high. And taken separately, all these threats are relatively limited. But it is their overlap, which was growing in the late 2010s, that actually posed a serious security issue to Central Asia. We shouldn't overestimate it, but we shouldn't underestimate it either. And affected Russia by extension, as a macro-Eurasian power with security interest, presence, allies in Central Asia. Now, the Taliban fell out with ISIS from the outset as a more radical rival. They engaged it militarily. They also capitalized on this politically, which is no less important, by trying to pose as a lesser threat than ISIS, at least to the outer world, and by posing, but also being a more endemic and Afghan-centered force. So all this led to certain international reassessment of their role, including by Russia, and Taliban's anti-ISIS activities in Afghanistan were indeed one, not the sole, not the only reason, but one of the reasons behind Russia's initial decision to establish limited communication channels with them, which 3-4 years later, already after the US, the main protagonist, started to talk directly to the Taliban. So after that, these Russian contacts with the movement amounted to finally inviting them to both, actually, Moscow initiated negotiating formats on Afghanistan, to the regional consultations format, and to intra-Afghan dialogue. And ultimately, these have paid off once the Taliban came to power in August. Now, this abrupt withdrawal of residual Western forces and very swift Taliban takeover, all these did lead to decline in combat operations, in intensity of combat operations across Afghanistan. But the same things sharply raised the degree of overall uncertainty, with more unknowns than ever. And what worried Russia most was not so much the US withdrawal. Here I agree with Vanya. This withdrawal was long pending. It was a long way out, in many ways imminent. What worried it were the perils of transition and potential failure of any authority, any new authority, to ensure basic state control and functionality. So it's not so much the need to deal with the Taliban and government, or in principle, the need to deal with an Islamist government, okay? But the prospects of lack of any functional authority. You know, further destabilization all the way up to worst case scenario, you know, full-scale transnationalized civil war that troubled Moscow most and was, of course, aggravated by a number of factors, but including this, you know, possibly uncontrolled spread of a lot of abandoned, relatively modern weapons, for instance. Yeah. Now, more specifically, any intensification of intra-Afghan strife in northern Afghanistan is against Russia's interests. For all these reasons, it makes spillover of both violence and humanitarian crisis more likely, but above all, it risks drawing in Central Asian state and non-state actors. When it comes to non-state actors, it's on both sides of the border, actually. Yeah. So if the Afghan North becomes a real hub for massive resistance, or really major, let's say, resistance, led by, say, Afghan Tajik warlords, something that it falls short of so far. Yeah, but if that becomes the reality, then this would certainly draw in more militants from elsewhere, including from Central Asia, partly reproducing the situation that we saw in the 90s. And the other way around, I mean, if we see a major Taliban decisive kind of particularly brutal crackdown against, say, disloyal northern enclaves, if any, again, that would push local militants, especially Central Asians, to infiltrate Central Asia. And this time, all this is compounded by a new risk, which is so far more perceived than real, fortunately. Yeah, but we don't know how it turns out. Yeah, and that's the risk of well, sizable, at least sizable Afghan refugee flows into previously marginal destination for them. You know, Central Asia. Yeah. So if Russia's uncontested priority is stability, you know. Uncontested priority, that's Lavrov's speaking, yeah? That's the phrase is from him. Yeah? Uncontested priority is regional stability. The question is it stability at any price? Okay. And let's be blunt, is it stability at the price of the second emirate? An interesting question, yeah? Now, for the time being, Russia has kind of accepted the Taliban as a caretaker, as an interim government. Not that it had much choice, like everyone else. But in theory, I mean, Russia has lived with Islamist-dominated governments and can live with an Islamist-dominated government, especially if it gradually moderates in the direction of something like a Sunni-dominated version of fundamentalist Iran. Yeah? But in practice, of course, Russia's approach to the Taliban is far from finalized. It evolves and it is shaped by two fundamental conditions. The Taliban's ability to ensure basic functionality of the Afghan state and to significantly reduce armed violence. So if, well, one of the main reasons Russia sticks so much to this idea of not very realistic at the time, this idea of fully inclusive, you know, coalition government, it's not just for fun, you know, and it's not just a bow to our Central Asian allies. It's based on Russia's firm belief that this is the only way for any government in Afghanistan to fulfill these, to meet these two fundamental conditions. Now, Russia's more practical security concerns, both before the Taliban takeover, with the previous government, yeah, and with the current government, de facto government, they remain the same. Yeah? Anti-terrorism and drug control. Let's use a softer term, yeah, than counter-narcotics, just plainly. Now, on the first count, on anti-terrorism, to the extent new Afghan authorities could extend state control into the country's gray areas and rein into militant terrorist groups, this is a positive development for Russia. Especially, of course, as it concerns those approximately 2,000, that's official estimate, yeah, of ISIS elements in the north. Yeah? And here Russia, I would say, is even ready to give the Taliban some leeway. So even our MFA's anti-terrorism branch, for instance, who are not known for any Taliban sympathies, who were really very harsh on the Taliban all these years, but even they earlier this month, they kind of sounded softer. They were saying that, like, the Taliban, they are still to devise their nation's counter-terrorist policy as the new government. This requires time. That on the one hand, we cannot confirm that they cut ties to transnational terrorist networks completely, but we cannot confirm the opposite either at this stage. So this is clearly a political message. And the message is the ball is now on the side of the Taliban, especially since they are striving for international legitimization. Now, in that quest, they are unlikely to
quickly...
Katya,
I just want to ask you, we have like, just if you could wrap up in a minute or so.
I will. I'll skip the Russia-Central Asia story. We can return to it in the discussion, yeah? But two concerns I have to go through them. So in that quest for legitimacy, okay, for international legitimacy, any fast or major progress on inclusive coalition government is unlikely. If any, progress would be nominal, really kind of cosmetic. So to compensate for that, to make up for that, the easiest way for the Taliban is to step up their anti-ISIS efforts. So far, they've done something. They killed Abu Umar Khorasani, the head of ISIS-K, but not much, not a big deal to kill someone who's already in prison and who's been detained by the previous government. Yeah. So far, they kind of made it cheap. Okay. So yes, they mounted this crackdown on ISIS hideouts, including in Kabul this month. An anti-terrorist operation in Al-Ghar. They've reoriented their Badr 313 special brigade to focus now almost entirely on ISIS. On other fronts, I mean, reportedly, that cannot be fully verified. I don't know what Nargis says, but reportedly they have moved forced Uyghur militants, ETIM militants, away from the border with China, obviously as to court China. Yeah, but any going beyond that will imply showing they're doing something to control shadowy parts of their own movement. And that's harder to achieve, and that will take longer because some of these segments are not just momentary fellow travelers, using Putin's jargon from his sources. They are not momentary companions. They've been with the movement throughout. Yeah. Now on drug control, just 2 words. There are no shortcuts inside. Okay, Taliban pledged resolve many times before they came to government, straight after takeover, resolve against illicit drugs. And it's not just them succumbing kind of to external pressure. They cite their own reasons. They cite religious imperatives. They cite their own immense, unprecedented success in bringing poppy cultivation and opium production to very low levels, minimal levels back in 2001. And interestingly, they start increasingly citing the growing abuse among Afghans, Afghan youth, as a rationale. Also, as a de facto government, they are now even more heavily pushed towards stricter drug control by the need for international legitimization than they had been back in the 90s. At that time, one of the main reasons they adopted a poppy ban was international strive for international legitimacy. Now this need is even greater. Unfortunately, it all collapses when it comes to economy. Economically, the Taliban, or I dare say, Afghanistan as a whole, can even less afford harsh drug control policies now than they had back, than they could back in the late 90s. So patience is needed on the matter. And more generally, across post-conflict, conflict areas and drug-producing countries, more effective drug control always comes only after and on condition of end of major fighting, and after peace solidifies. So peace first, drugs next. Yeah. And only as a result of increased state functionality and control, never before those are ensured. So on both counts, anti-terrorism and drug control, the Taliban will face a wide range of hurdles, including, of course, internal disagreements. But in addition to their major enforcement potential, which remains their main asset, okay? Another factor and that's my final phrase, yeah, don't worry. Another factor that plays into their hands, okay, is profound conflict, violence, fatigue among all strata of the Afghan people. That's domestically, yeah? And externally, of course, the main leverage for them to moderate their course and to at least try to show some progress in meeting international security concerns is, of course, their acute need for foreign aid to keep things going, to meet basic humanitarian reconstruction and economic needs. I'll have to stop here, but we'll hopefully come back to the Russia Central Asian sort of angle. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much also for providing that important conceptual framework about the sequencing of these various things the international community, including Russia, wants to see. Our next speaker, no stranger to our events, it's Nargis Kasanova, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for International Relations and Regional, at Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and Regional Studies of KIMEP University in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Prolific author, Dr. Kasanova has been doing the rounds on many of these regarding Central Asian reactions to the situation in Afghanistan, and of course, arranging her own conferences. So Nargis, welcome. And we're really curious to hear your latest thoughts and perspectives about how the region views the current situation.
Thank you very much, Alex. And it's great to go after Ivan and Katya. I'm always learning a lot from them. When it comes to the situation and how it affects Central Asian policies, approaches, and all that, I see two main factors. These are interlinked factors, and one is the situation in Afghanistan. And as we already mentioned, it's very complex, very dramatic, fluid, and also the US troops withdrawal. And not so much as a factor that has changed the security situation in the region, which would be part of this first factor, but kind of possibly a signal of the overall lessening of the US engagement in the region. And I think we can all agree that there is a serious reformatting of the geopolitical environment in Eurasia going on. Under the circumstances, Central Asian governments need to make decisions with big implications, and they are hard to make. As Katya mentioned, there are a lot of uncertainties. There are many moving parts, and the stakes are high. Ivan already mentioned the kind of the fact that Central Asian governments have taken different approaches, and we have a spectrum. So on the one end, we have Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan makes kind of most effort to accommodate the Taliban. We saw Foreign Minister Kamilov taking delegation to Kabul, negotiating with the Taliban government, and they want, of course, security assurances, but they also want to continue developing these big infrastructure projects that would connect Uzbekistan via Afghanistan with South Asia. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have Tajikistan, the most skeptical about the Taliban government for kind of obvious reasons. But despite these differences, I think we can kind of define a set of shared perceptions and concerns that Central Asians have. The first one is sort of obvious. The security situation got much worse. The second one is that the US withdrawal is a fait accompli, and what was mentioned before, the kind of some people didn't believe there will be any withdrawal, or there would be a full withdrawal, so sort of like what happening with 2014 withdrawal, when it was announced, and then some troops stayed, and actually we saw even more resources going to Afghanistan. So now we know they are out, and that's an important factor. And the kind of Russia now is the principal security provider, and therefore has a bigger leverage in the region, and can sort of use this opportunity to wrap Central Asian states sort of tighter into its fold. And well, the CSTO, we see CSTO being reinvigorated. We see growing Russian military presence in the region, strengthening of the military bases, and we also hear these discussions, how it will affect the Eurasian Economic Union, and whether Uzbekistan will become a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. So kind of it goes across the board. Plus, China has, we know that China has an interest in the security and stability of the region, and we know that it will be active, and that security cooperation, China Central Asia security cooperation, will go on. So these considerations, they shape and will shape Central Asian policies and actions, and we already see how they are playing out with their decisions. For example, in summer there were reports that the Pentagon was exploring the possibility of Central Asia hosting some post-withdrawal military facilities, and I think in principle Central Asian governments would have been interested. Yeah. But given given the circumstances, that would be a very risky, costly undertaking, and they don't want to definitely clearly anger. They wouldn't want to do it against Russian objections. Another example is refugees, and we also heard that Americans made requests to Central Asians to host Afghans who work together with the Americans, to give them this temporary asylum. And once again, I think that these requests were considered by Central Asian governments. And we know that, for example, in Kazakhstan, there were some preparations for a small intake of refugees, but then it was aborted, and it's not clear, which factors resulted in this change of mind, because there is a very strong anti-refugee rhetoric coming from Moscow, but also we should mention that the kind of the attitudes, the public attitudes to refugees, to the possibility of hosting refugees, is not is not very welcoming, and Central Asia doesn't have a particularly good record now in this department. So there are negotiations that the EU has with Tajikistan on kind of bigger intake of refugees, and initially Tajikistan promised to let in 100,000. That obviously didn't happen. Now the total, all the new refugees, they say, is about between 13 and 15,000 Afghan refugees are in Tajikistan. But basically, these are the refugees who can afford to be refugees there, and there are reports that they have to get the status, they need to pay the rent for the year in advance, and so it's all small scale, and there are some kind of all kinds of political considerations that go into making these decisions by governments. Maybe we should also mention here the kind of the outline in this regard that Kyrgyzstan decided to accept, gave student visas to 200 Afghan students to study at AUTSA, which is, a very good development. So the kind of the Central Asian governments are grappling with these new realities, and I think they will be trying to retain room for maneuver. And actually, I would think that this Uzbekistan's push for maintaining the corridor via Afghanistan to South Asia is also an attempt to unlock itself and to have a bigger room for maneuver overall, economically, geopolitically, and so on. But so far, this room has been shrinking. And the governments are watching closely what's happening, and the situation is fluid. And Katya very eloquently discussed the situation in Afghanistan, and what can work, what cannot work. Now we're all worried. It seems quite grim at the moment, the capacity of the Taliban to govern and all that. So the kind of the big question is what will happen, in Afghanistan, in northern Afghanistan, and if the security situation worsens considerably, can Russia deliver? Because now it is Russia that is the kind of the main player, the main security provider in the region. So whether it can deliver, or if it cannot deliver, what happens next, and and probably remember how Karimov's disappointment when Russia, in his opinion, didn't deliver, in the 90s, when the situation was also problematic, and then Uzbekistan, suspended membership in the CSTO. So it's really hard to predict anything. But now I think the ball is not only in the court of the Taliban, it's in all our courts, in the courts of Central Asian governments as well. Some big decisions need to be made. Thank you.
Nargis, thanks so much. And also thanks for bringing up that point about US basing facilities. And it was often presented as sort of Putin vetoing sort of these requests, but in fact, it was much more complicated than that. There was an attempt to negotiate directly with the Central Asian states, which conjured up memories and experiences of the previous 2 decades. And we could have a whole seminar on that, and maybe we will. But last but certainly not least, I'm just delighted to introduce Artemy Kalinovsky, who's a professor of Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet studies at Temple University with lines in both history and in political science. He spent a decade teaching at the University of Amsterdam, has written 2 wonderful books about the region. And so Artemy, welcome. And we're really curious to get your take too, informed by some of the previous research that you've done on Afghan, Soviet, Central Asian relations.
All right, thank you so much. And I really like this unorthodox approach of putting the historian on a current affairs panel last. I usually try to put the historian first and then forget about what the historian says. So I like this. That having been said, I should say that I'm a historian who's fairly skeptical about the idea of the lessons of history and so forth, at least in any straightforward policy sense. I do think, however, that political actors and government leaders take lessons of history seriously, or try to understand the lessons of history. And so trying to understand how the actors in the region understand their history with Afghanistan is going to be important. So what I want to do is draw your attention to 2 things. One, I want to kind of talk about 2 modalities in relations between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan in the 20th and 21st century. And we'll call those connectivity and security. They have sometimes been kind of mutually reinforcing, so connectivity leading to greater security and vice versa, and sometimes actually very contradictory, right? Emphasis on one making the other more difficult. What I mean by connectivity, I mean, of course, the Soviet Union, in a sense, well, the Russian Empire before that, and then the Soviet Union really kind of draws a sharp line, right? A reinforced border between what become the republics of the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. But from the 1950s onwards, there is actually an effort by the Soviet Union to promote ties between the Central Asian republics, particularly Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, to a lesser extent Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan, which was a friendly government and increasingly looking to the Soviet Union for development assistance. Those connections included exchanges of experts and students, as well as discussions about mutual infrastructural projects along the Panj, the Amul Darya. During the war, of course, Central Asia played a particularly important role, with thousands of soldiers, advisors, and so on participating in that conflict on the Soviet side, and with Soviet Central Asia playing host to officers of Afghanistan's military, in some cases to medical evacuees, and so on and so forth. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the lead up to the Soviet withdrawal, there was actually an attempt by the Soviet Union to increase connections between those republics and Afghanistan directly, partially through promoting economic relations and trade. Even before the Soviet Union collapsed, the republics send their own representatives to work within the Soviet embassy to establish bilateral ties. The idea here being that greater trade, greater connections between these republics and Afghanistan will actually help promote stability in Afghanistan itself and in the region going forward. After the Soviet Union collapses and the communist government, or what's left of it, falls 4 months later in 1992, the roles change, of course. Russia is now, post-Soviet Russia is now more happy to work with the Soviet Union's former enemies, including people like Ahmad Shah Massoud and Burhanuddin Rabbani, although they're not particularly involved in Afghanistan during this period. However, during the civil war in Tajikistan, you have the United Tajik Opposition, which takes refuge in northern Tajikistan and appoint, when that's controlled by these leaders. But when Massoud and others are increasingly looking to Russia for support against the Taliban, and those connections in turn help Russia, or push Russia, to use its influence to help negotiate an end to that war in Tajikistan. Interesting too that since 2001, some of these ideas have been revived, partially with the input of Central Asian governments, but also by particularly successive US administrations who were working along a similar logic, that greater economic exchange in the region would help lead to greater stability. I'm talking about the New Silk Road projects, the New Silk Roads project that was so favored by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but also other versions of it, which have been favored by Donald Rumsfeld and others. Their physical manifestation is the long-planned TAPI pipeline, and the idea of exporting electricity from the Rogun Dam to Afghanistan, a dream, of course, that goes back into the Soviet era. Interestingly, as with New Silk Road, as with the kind of late Soviet idea of promoting connections in this region, the New Silk Road project did not envision the US heavily investing in these actual projects, but rather just kind of supporting them and hoping things would take care of themselves, which of course they have not. In fact, one of the interesting things about particularly Tajikistan's response to the rise of Taliban takeover is that they're playing they've been, as has already been pointed out, they've been kind of the most critical of the Taliban of anybody in the region. And yet they've also taken out enormous loans to fund the construction of Ragun, which clearly are going to be paid back. The idea was that they were going to be paid back through exports to Afghanistan and beyond, electricity exports to Afghanistan and beyond. So Tajikistan's government, I think, as much as anybody, is interested in stability at any price. But I'll come back later to why they might not necessarily see a Taliban-ruled government as the best guarantor of stability. And so the other side of this is security. And as I've already said, of course, the Soviet Union operated a very harsh border regime. That border regime came into place in the 1930s and never really disappeared, even during the Cold War. Yes, there's promotion of exchange, but it is there despite this very strict border regime. It is very heavily controlled. At the same time, from Moscow's point of view, Afghanistan is not a threat to Central Asia, except insofar as it can be used by the US in a Cold War context. That's true for most of the war. They're not afraid, as some people, including those who worked at Columbia University in the 1980s, believed that Central Asians were going to rebel against Moscow's rule because of what was going on in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. It's only in the late 1980s that you see some officials try to use the threat to Central Asia posed by Islamist groups in Afghanistan to justify slowing down the withdrawal. But it's very much a minority view. It's very much a marginal view right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so we see that in the 1990s, eventually, as Russia starts to turn its attention again to Afghanistan, it is, cooperating with former enemies to create a kind of security corridor in northern Afghanistan against the Taliban, which, again, as has been pointed out, I think correctly, by Dr. Stepanova, was at that point seen as a potential threat. So what are the lessons that I think Russia and to some extent the Central Asian governments draw on this? Well, one is, I think that's been pretty consistent, is this idea that a coalition government is the best source of stability in Afghanistan. Where does this come from? This is something that took hold among Soviet leaders and Soviet diplomats starting around 1986, 1987, when it became clear that, it had long been clear that a communist government on its own was not going to hold power in Kabul. And Soviet hopes for a withdrawal were based on keeping that communist government at the core, but bringing in members of the opposition and other groups into a government with the idea that they could then hold power after the Soviet Union was gone. They were never able to achieve that, in part because the communist leadership was not actually so eager to share power with some of the people that the Soviets wanted to bring in, and also because increasingly members of the opposition felt that they could achieve an outright victory. But nevertheless, the idea that only a coalition government, if it could be achieved, would bring stability, I think, held. And the civil war in the 90s, in a way, actually served to prove that point. The way I read, and of course, I'm not a specialist in contemporary Russia the way other people here are, but the way I've been reading a lot of statements by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Kabulov and other people who are directly involved in Afghanistan is, we realize that the Taliban is going to be at the core of any government that's going to emerge, but ultimately, and I think Kabulov even said this at some point in the late spring, once kind of the fever passes, I'm paraphrasing here, once the fever passes and everybody calms down, they'll see that it's everybody's best interest to form a coalition government with everybody at the table. And I think we see that still today, even though it's clear now that it's going to be much harder to convince the Taliban to get into some kind of coalition government. The other kind of long-term lesson, the coalition government, I think this is also perhaps what's going on behind Emomali Rahmon's kind of rhetoric in criticizing the Taliban. My first reading of it, this is primarily for domestic audiences. This is about, showing people who really is the father of the Tajik nation by also supporting the Tajiks on the other side. But I think this may be another aspect of it, that if there's this deep held belief that only a coalition government is actually going to bring the kind of stability that will allow Tajikistan to export electricity and feel secure within its own borders and so on, then this is a way maybe of pushing the Taliban towards that goal. This is more speculative, but this is one thing I would kind of want to know from people who have maybe more up-to-date information. The other big lesson, of course, I think for post-Soviet Russia was about being very careful in intervening militarily abroad. And in fact, we've seen that one of the few, one thing that was quite uncontroversial for governments of the 90s and in the 2000s was, recognizing that the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan was largely a mistake. And it's only in the last few years that we've seen a kind of reevaluation of this, right? Not just criticizing how the withdrawal was done or something like that, but actually saying, you know what, there was a reason that we intervened. It had to do with our security, and whatever problems we had as a result, we were right to do this. And I think the obvious backgrounds to this were Russia's continued involvement in Syria, which seemed to break this older pattern. But the other place where Russia has been kind of largely unwilling to intervene directly is, of course, in Central Asia itself, right? Russia plays a diplomatic role there. It's very involved, I think, in terms of intelligence sharing, but it does not intervene militarily in the kind of localized conflicts and internal conflicts that have broken out there. So if these are lessons of history, right, and I think Russian officials will often say, for example, we've learned our lesson in Afghanistan, right? There was that famous op-ed by Boris Gromov and I think Dmitry Rogozin in the New York Times in 2010 or 2011, where they said, we learned our lessons in Afghanistan, we're not going to go back in there, et cetera, et cetera. The past is constantly being revised, right? And I wonder if how long, how powerful these lessons are, right? At what point is there going to be a rereading of the past, a rereading of these lessons where Russian foreign policymakers do say, well, you know what, we've stayed out of Afghanistan, or we've tried to kind of do it at some reserve, but maybe at this point, at some point, we need to think about becoming more directly involved to protect our interests, to protect Central Asia. We've stayed out of military, we've avoided getting directly involved in military situations in Central Asia, but what are the conditions under which we have to move beyond that? Or, conversely, we've always said we want a coalition government, but, do we now believe that actually the Taliban has changed enough in certain ways, or is powerful enough that maybe this is the way to achieve stability going forward? So those are a historian's, as usual, pessimistic takes on what has been going on over the last 30 years and how that might be informing what is going on today. And thank you again for having me.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Artemy. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all the panelists for the incredibly stimulating comments. I've learned a ton already. I want to just throw out one question that I think there was a little bit said about, but I'd love to hear a little bit more, which is at a higher level, what do all of you think will be the effect of the current situation in Afghanistan on Russia's relationship with China? So the U.S. getting the U.S. out of Afghanistan could have seemed a very common, shared long-term goal for both Russia and China. But now the U.S. is gone. Is this an opportunity for further collaboration between Russia and China? Another place where Russia and China can work together, can have common interests? Is it a new opportunity for conflict? There was a little bit said about China's going to do its thing here and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Or should we be thinking about this as totally unrelated? Like we can go about having this conversation about what Russia's policy towards Afghanistan is going to be, and then we can have a separate conversation about what China's policy towards Afghanistan is going to be, but the two aren't related to each other. So just interested in a little bit of thoughts on that. And I will just point out we have some questions in Q&A. I'd like to call on the audience to add more questions to Q&A if they were interested. And we also have a bit of limited time at this point, but we have about 25 minutes left. So Russia and China, who wants to take first? Who's interested in answering that question? Ivan?
I can answer it, but I will not have I'm not going to have a very exciting answer. I think the question is very exciting, and my answer is not going to be that much exciting. Chinese and Russia's position on Afghanistan will be related. They will have something in common. There will be discussions. Ministries of Foreign Affairs, probably MODs will discuss it. So they will be related, no question about it. However, the Afghan issue will not be a big facilitating factor for cooperation, and it will not be an issue of big disagreement. So this will be related. So I would say Afghanistan will have nothing, will not be a very special issue in Russia-China relations, maybe at some point relatively important, at some moments relatively marginal. And I think that a little bit Russia and China will push a ball to each other's side. Russia will say, okay, China, please pay for Afghanistan's security. And China will say, no, you, Russia, also do something there. Do not leave us alone. I think it is in the air, not only in Russia, but in the United Kingdom, in the United States, that, okay, if all great powers go to Afghanistan and get defeated, when finally China does it.
Right.
China. So I think that everyone wants, to some extent, China to take some responsibility for Afghanistan, but not in very egoistic way, as usually China does everything, but in more an altruistic way. And of course, China to some extent resists that. But I think that Russia's very vague push toward that is not something different from what the rest of the world would like.
Thanks, Ivan. Katya?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Just, I mean, Josh, I appreciate this kind of big power focus, you know, great powers, strategic triangles, or sort of, but frankly, I think Afghanistan is precisely the case, which shows that these are a bit outdated. You know, that no, I mean, if you're looking for like grand deals, like can Russia and China sort it out, it just no longer works at all. You know,
No,
we've seen profound regionalization of everything, from politics to security to economics, in this and other regions. You know, so yes, China is a partner, natural partner, but it would never be the only, you know, part of the picture. And in fact, coming back to Artemy's very interesting presentation, I think it links. I think another lesson learned from Afghanistan, it's not just sheer recognition that, you know, we face really important historical and practical, pragmatic constraints and we just cannot have security presence there, period. And this is a very solid line, you know, don't expect it to change any time in any foreseeable future. But also another lesson to be learned is that for Russia now, collective action in cooperation with regional partners, all of them, not just Central Asians, you know, I call them the big four, you know. Well, now it's mostly, of course, China, Pakistan, Iran, yeah. A bit less so India, but I think India will regain its place in this big four of Afghanistan's neighbors. So collective action in cooperation with regional partners and multilateral frameworks with very heavy regional footprint. These are no less or even more important for Russia than its own kind of bilateral Russian-Afghan track. And of course, it naturally includes China as a heavyweight. I mean, both China and Russia, if you remember, were among those top 3-4 states that were mentioned by the Taliban straight after takeover as the ones with whom they kind of have established good relations. But frankly, de facto, Russia retains less practical leverage, if I may so, directly vis-a-vis Afghanistan, not in Central Asia where it does have, leverage, but directly vis-a-vis Afghanistan. It's basically its mediating role, its UN Security Council role, sanctions, recognition, things like that. Yeah, it's mostly diplomatic. Yeah, but it retains less leverage than with the Taliban authorities in practical sense that either Pakistan or Qatar or China. China will not rush to invest in Afghanistan very quickly, but it remains the economic heavyweight. So it is there by default. And Russia, in contrast to China or India, well, at least until recently, has no major economic ties or projects in Afghanistan or with Afghanistan. It has even less leverage than most Central Asian states that at least supply half of Afghanistan, half of electricity that Afghanistan consumes. The other half is provided by Iran. And I mean, they're being generous. They are owed a huge, huge amount of money, like over 60 million, I think. But they've been nice, not for the sake of the Taliban, I think for the sake of Afghanistan. They have not cut supply. And then, of course, in contrast to both Pakistan and Iran, I mean, Russia does not have major security and aid leverage on the local parties, which is why it prioritizes multilateral schemes. And one of them is not all, some of them go beyond, like we have the Troika Plus format, yeah? But they will also see, I'm interested to see more ad hoc formats that we actually see, which for instance involve Russia without Western or Middle Eastern participation, like this trio meeting with the Taliban and then meeting with Dr. Abdullah and with Karzai, so Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and discussing precisely drug control, anti-terrorism, governance issues, and so on. So I think, and then of course, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but again, I wouldn't focus just on Russia and China. I'd say the inclusion of Iran was probably an even more important thing during this strange summit in mid-September, which was conspicuously ignored by both presidents. President Putin did not appear at the CSTO summit, but also at SCO summit next day, and Chairman Xi Jinping, okay?
Yep.
But I have to stop here, but we can elaborate here.
Nargis?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Katya. I think the sort of the configure now it's up to the up to the region, to powers in the region, bigger powers, smaller powers, and the kind of it's sort of these configurations, not just Russia and China. I think it's kind of interesting to see what's going to happen. I think it will be interesting to see how it will play out in Central Asia, yeah, and what kind of cooperation is possible. We had the whole panel on Russia, China, and what's happening in Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago, and sort of the conclusion was that there will be partnerships, especially kind of under the umbrella of the SCO, but it will not be a kind of a full-fledged partnership, yeah? and both sides will continue doing their own things largely. But well, I will be curious to see what's going to happen to the quadrilateral mechanism that China established with Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. How that will work, because that's the format that was excluding Russia. So what will happen to this mechanism? And yes, let's see how all these things will play out.
Thanks so much. Yeah, to be very clear, my question wasn't, will Russia and China work this out and it'll get settled? It was more about Russian-Chinese relationships. What would the new developments in Afghanistan be more of a point for conflict, cooperation, or neither between those two countries? But let me move on. I'm going to pull together a couple different questions from the chat. One is from Jim and one is from Iskander. which is both sort of asking questions about the sort of part that Ivan made in the beginning, that so far, it seems like that Afghanistan is not interested in becoming an exporter of global jihad from Afghanistan. But the question still remains, right? One question has to do with, from Jim, which has to do with Al-Qaeda. There doesn't seem to be much being said about Al-Qaeda right now. Is that because, was Al-Qaeda left out of this because Al-Qaeda is irrelevant? Is Al-Qaeda kind of flying under the radar at this point? Will we see much from Al-Qaeda now that the Taliban is back in power, or a resurgence of Al-Qaeda now that the Taliban is back in power? And then slightly more generally, less about Al-Qaeda in particular, but about the possibility of jihads. Okay, so if the current Afghan government seems less interested in global jihad, what about regional, right? And so, and maybe not even through direct exportation of foreign fighters, but more through sort of being an example about leading to rise of the threats of Islamicism in other Central Asian countries, and Iskandar in particular in Tajikistan. So I think those two are closely enough related that, we can kind of dig a little bit deeper into this role of what role we expect the Taliban to be playing, if not directly, in indirectly facilitating Islamicist movements and even more jihadist movements like Al-Qaeda. Who wants to take a first shot at either part of that?
I can, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Ivan.
Very short on Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is so deeply integrated with the Taliban that right now, with so many people trying not to be hostile to Taliban, this allows exactly Al-Qaeda to fly under the radar. If you want to be hostile to the Taliban, you raise the issue of Al-Qaeda. If you do not want, you do not raise it. So Al-Qaeda is undividable right now from the Taliban, in particular from the military structures of the Taliban, in particular in some regions of Afghanistan. But Al-Qaeda also changed, by the way. Al-Qaeda is also not at the front of the international jihad anymore. Al-Qaeda is quite localized. Maybe it will reemerge as a global movement, globalist movement, but right now it's just an international element of the mostly national Taliban. Such a strange combination, and I think that it may continue like that. So Al-Qaeda right now is not an imminent threat. The movement of Taliban, of course, inspires a lot all jihadists, regionally and globally. Because that's for jihadists, it's a huge example that if you stick to your ideas, if you are a true believer, if you do not make any concessions, and so on, you finally win. And that is a great aspiration for everyone. I would compare it, to what, after in some country, a national team wins some sports, for example, I don't know, swimmers, alpine skiers, or whatever. A national team wins something, and then you have a flow of kids going into these particular sports in this country. So I think that a lot of people. So the effect will be something like that. We will have a lot of people thinking of what the true belief is, how important it is to be committed to your ideas, and this will have implications in Central Asia, in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, everywhere, regionally and globally. So that will be a booster for all people who consider these issues seriously. But I want to address very quickly two issues. First, whether the Taliban will be able to fight and to defeat Islamic State. I do admit that the Taliban is antagonistic with the Islamic State. That is just a matter of fact. We know that. I think the Taliban will try to fight them, and does fight right now. However, I doubt that the Taliban will be able to defeat Islamic State in Afghanistan. For a number of reasons, I will not go into all that, but just one major reason. If you look at various regional situations where jihadist movements were important, like in Northern Caucasus in Russia, in Syria, in Iraq, and so on, how actually international jihadists, how that element was taken out of regional conflicts, how they were won. Not by fully defeating, but making the pressure which makes them to leave to another conflict. From Chechnya, they were moved partly to Afghanistan, partly to Turkey, partly to the Middle East, then all this concentrated in Syria, and so on and so on. Right now, it looks like Afghanistan is the end stop. Where can you actually push them? You can either push them to Central Asia immediately, or you can push them to Pakistan. Both Russia and Central Asia on the one hand, and Pakistan on the other hand, make clear that no, you fight them on the Afghan territory. And I think that sometime later, even if the Taliban is committed to fighting the Islamic State, they will find out that this is mission impossible. You can't just kill all them, you should push them somewhere. And there is no place to push them out, at least right now. If there is another jihadist conflict, regional conflict, they may flee there. But right now, we do not have that type of a jihadist conflict. That's why tension in this issue will continue. And like previous Afghans, the Afghans of the Karzai government, of the Ghani government, you know, they were complaining, like, you sent to our country all these jihadists, and now we are suffering from them. You all know they were making that point. And I think that the Taliban at some point will say the same. Look, we are fighting all bad guys from all around. What's the problem with that? So I think that that's why that even if the Taliban is committed to fighting the Islamic State, this commitment may not survive too long, and they will make conditions to foreigners who want them to fight the Islamic State inside the country. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. And Katya, you wanted to weigh in on this as well. If I can ask you to try to be a little brief, we're running really short on time and we want to get one more question in. You're muted right now. Katya, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Well, according to Ivan's categorization, okay, I'm the one who wouldn't raise the issue of Al-Qaeda because I don't think it's very relevant at the moment. And of course, Taliban is a very different movement from Al-Qaeda. I don't see any merge. Al-Qaeda itself, I mean, it evolved so extensively in the course of these 2 decades, you know, from this more consolidated sort of base and flat transnational network. I was using the term post-Al-Qaeda movement, referring to global Salafist jihadist movement long ago. I mean, what exactly do we refer to if you want to talk about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? Now, the issue of regional jihad and regional caliphate. Well, we know who is propagating that. That's precisely the ideology of ISIS Khorasan. I mean, that's their main distinction from the Taliban. This is the issue. By the way, they have serious, not just ideological, but also theological differences. And, you know, there were problems that the Taliban was having with ISIS central core leadership in the Near East, in Syria and Iraq, when they asked them basically to subdue themselves to Khorasan, and they said no. And in ISIS central publications, mainstream publications, they are often referred to as the Taliban, as an Afghan nationalist movement, and of course in sharp contrast. And one of the reasons we pay so much attention to this ISIS-K, which after all, it's not a large group. It doesn't have mass social base in Afghanistan. Yeah, its compact locations more or less are limited, largely to a bit in the east and some in the north. Yeah, mostly half and half these days. Yeah. But one of the reasons they are dangerous is precisely because no borders. I mean, they're looking, period, for a regional caliphate. There is no question about that. And then what is a valid question? And thanks to the one who raised it, actually. We were talking, when we were talking about Taliban or other groups based in Afghanistan, we so far raised this more specific security issues, yeah, like direct spillover of militancy, drug trafficking, spillover of extremism, whatever. But of course, there is this genuine issue of any broader impact that the very fact of the Taliban return to power in Afghanistan, as after all a fundamentalist Islamist opposition, may have on spread of fundamentalist influences and forms of Islam, for instance, in Central Asia. That's a valid question. It remains to be seen, the scale of this potential, impact. And coming back to what Nargis said, what Russia could deliver and what it cannot deliver. Well, this is certainly the issue which is not for Russia to sort out. You see, Russia can give security assistance. It can bolster its hardware presence, the hardware equipment on its bases. It can do all sorts of things, yeah. But this particular peril, if you like, or potential threat, it can only be addressed, reduced, and neutralized by the Central Asian states and by their own I'd say policy and development choices, by their religious policies and by evolution of their own social-political systems. But I agree that this is a valid question. Thanks so much. Sorry.
Katya, thank you. And actually, I want to give the floor to Artemi for the very last question, building on this question of development models. I know, Artemi, you're currently involved in a project looking at competing developmental models in Central Asia during that transition process, and you referenced the New Silk Road. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about an internationally or a Western isolated Taliban and its development options. What is the relationship between external recognition and the possibilities of tapping into some of this alternative foreign assistance, possibly as part of the Belt and Road, possibly with sort of financing on the Gulf? Sort of in your map, where would you locate the possibilities for Afghanistan now going forward in terms of external sponsors?
That's a great question. My research, I've been talking to Central Asian experts, especially ones who kind of crossed this 1991 divide. And I have to say, I've never interviewed any Taliban economists or planners. But it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the 1990s, right, the Taliban didn't seem to be all that interested. They seem to be much more interested in consolidating control and restoring possibilities for trade within Afghanistan and so on. They were sort of negotiating access to a gas pipeline and so forth, but they didn't seem to be actually all that interested. They weren't really willing to make that trade-off in terms of, kind of giving up some sovereignty or in return for getting economic development aid. And so it's very hard to say what kind of models they might have in mind. And obviously they've changed a lot since the 1990s. If they're looking, let's say, to China, right, what is the Chinese model of development assistance in Central Asia that they might export here and elsewhere as well, right? It is get access to mineral and hydrocarbon resources. In exchange for that, pay for some infrastructure and government facilities and maybe even rehabilitate some older factories, right? Is that going to be attractive to a group like the Taliban? Maybe, insofar as it can provide them a revenue stream going forward. It's not a development project in the sense that it'll create jobs for, you know, a significant percentage of Afghanistanis, but it is, in a sense, a way for the Taliban to tap into a revenue stream that's going to be much less controversial than, let's say, taxing the export of opium. So I think that's one real possibility. I think in terms of the Gulf states, you know, I think realistically what you would see is something similar, right? I mean, humanitarian aid aside, which helps support short-term consumption, or help the government try to get through budget shortfalls. You know, realistically, considering where it's located, considering what kind of access it has to, you know, international trade routes, etc. I would think the most likely scenario is where maybe the Gulf countries come in and help revive some Soviet-era geological projects, whether that's natural gas exploration in the north or something else. It's hard for me at this point to see something more large scale than that. I do think it's more likely in the 90s than in the 1990s that the Taliban will try to explore these kind of options rather than just saying, you know, what we care about is being left alone, you know, forget all of this international development stuff completely.
Great. Thank you. So folks, we are at time. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to the audience for saying your lunch and morning and evening hours. We'll keep a close eye on developments, and hopefully we can do this again soon. Josh, do you want to say anything in closing?
Yeah, just want to give a shout out that we'll be back November 29th, and we'll be doing a 1-year retrospective on U.S. foreign policy towards Russia under the Biden administration. So that's our next planned New York City Russia public policy event. Wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Incredibly informative and super interesting, and hope to see many of you at our events in the future. And you can throw November 29th at the same time on your calendar now. Alex, back to you. Okay, great. Well then, thanks everybody.
Bye. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.